Hello, everybody, and welcome to this new episode from the empty waiting room. Self-organising behaviours for managing in the here and now. Nick, so what are we talking about today?
Thanks, Steve. Today's episode is a conversation about how to best manage in the here and now through a seemingly anarchic concept called self-organisation, or as one of my guests, Paul Snookes, longtime friend and co-founder of the Worcester Environmental Group, calls the passion and energy of the many. My other guest is Pip Cannons, chief exec of an organisation called Community Catalyst, and previously the creator of the very successful model of adult social care in Somerset. And both of my guests today are going to argue that trusting the power and spirit of local communities would get more value out of local authority commissioning by avoiding silo management and promoting biodiversity.
Right, that sounds interesting. I hope everybody enjoys it. Welcome everybody to next exciting episode of the podcast, The Empty Waiting Room. This one's called Self-Organising Behaviours for Managing in the Here and Now. So Nick, what are we talking about today then?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, and thanks, Pip and Paul, for agreeing to take part in this conversation about self-organisation. And the subtitle of the book, just to give it focus, is about working with people who have complex needs. However, as I think when Paul gets talking, we sort of engage with Paul, it can apply more widely than simply working with people who have complex social needs, as I'm sure Paul's story will illustrate. By way of introduction, this book's obviously based on my lifetime's work and research, and it's a manifesto for change that argues for a different, more radical way of delivering public services, one that's more citizen focused, more attuned to what people want. And I also argue that this way of working is cheaper than a top-down hierarchical way of delivering services. So it makes it very appropriate for our current economic climate. In this episode of the book, I want to explore one of the central principles for me of this new way of delivering public services. And that's the principle that occupies a whole chapter within the book, the principle of self-organisation. And it's what I refer to as working with the passion and energy of the many rather than the few. It's based on building trust, focused on local places, and starts with a citizen as customer or consumer perspective, and flourishes because people can use their strengths. In essence, that's a very crude summary behind self-organisation, which I am hoping, Pip and Paul, you'll expand on and put some colour on in terms of this episode of the podcast. So Pip, if I can get you and then Paul just to introduce yourselves, your own very brief CV of who you are and what you're up to, and anything you just want to say, and then we'll kind of get into some questions, which I'll lead you into a conversation rather than a series of statements.
Yeah, of course. Hi, my name is Pip, and I'm the CEO of Community Catalysts, a community interest company that was set up in 2009 to do actually all the things you've just said, Nick. So really, we were born out of a desire really to fill a gap. We saw that there was a lot of policy moving in the direction of enabling self management of people who have cause to draw on social care, but we couldn't see what there was for people to choose from. So there was a lack of stuff, if you like, a lack of understanding what was available that was different to what the system had been providing. So that's a little bit about sort of where Comcats has come from, and we've now developed all sorts of models around and ways of working that enable communities to be able to contribute in a more deliberate way. So my CV, so to speak, go back a bit before that. So I was working for the public sector. I worked at Somerset County Council as a commissioner for over 10 years, and while there was kind of a lead in taking forward a transformation programme, which again was about thinking differently about public services, particularly around adult social care. So rethinking, reforming, redoing that, and turning it from a to a listening service into one that connected with communities, that invested in communities, and enable people to be front and centre in their care and support, and communities to be a very much a part of that. So just a little bit about me.
Thanks, Pip. Paul?
Yeah, so I'm Paul Snookes, a co-founder of Worcester Environmental Group. It says on the tin what we're doing. Where there's a as there has to be a focus on climate change, but actually there's something that a lot of people are only just becoming aware of, is the biodiversity collapse. And so Worcester Environmental Group focuses on enhancing the biodiversity in the city. Cities can be great places for nature to flourish, actually. I sometimes hear the countryside being described as a green desert, but actually there's a lot of opportunities for nature to thrive in a mosaic of habitats in a city. So I'll go into in a bit more detail later on. So we set up this local charity to improve the biodiversity in the city and to get people connected with and understanding nature more. And when people feel more connected with nature and understand it more, they want to take more care of it. And we started that in 2018. The seeds of it were sown. Excuse the subtle pun there.
And I think the connection between the environment and people's well-being is well researched now. So I think it makes it extremely good to have, or to come at this issue from two different perspectives, if you like. One from the, if I can put it crudely, the social care, and the other from the environmental perspective. So thanks for that. I think, Paul, maybe if you could just start the conversation off by describing what you understand by self-organisation and why it's been successful for WEG, and then perhaps reflect and go on to reflect on some of the challenges that you've had to overcome, which I know we've certainly rehearsed in the past, haven't we? So
yeah,
it
we've
would
had
be good for you
exchanges.
Yeah.
On this topic. What I noticed just as an ordinary resident of the city is that there were areas of the city that were just being totally neglected. So I had been involved just as a volunteer in planting a new traditional orchard. I noticed that it was getting completely overwhelmed with scrub. And it's quite attractive to plant trees, and then people forget about them afterwards. So this was on city council land, and I was really quite concerned that if it turned back into scrub's great. It's a great habitat, but planners and developers see scrub as wasteland. We've lost thousands upon thousands of traditional orchards in Worcestershire, Herefordshire, and Gloucestershire. They're great, brilliant habitats for nature. Now the problem was we asked the local parish council, did they know who we could contact in the city council? No, they didn't know, and it took quite a long time to find. There's kind of this almost like a wall where you can't look over the wall and find out who's responsible. And it took quite some time to find out who was responsible. And we kind of reluctantly got permission to get a group of volunteers to start cutting back that scrub and restoring this traditional orchard. That's how we started. But we then, once that was successful, we got a toehold. And then we looked at the next area that needed a bit of work to be done. And we got hold of this officer again and made 3 or 4 proposals. And he admitted that he'd come to the meeting to say no to everything that we were going to propose, but they were so reasonable and so much needed to be done and nobody was doing it. He couldn't do anything but say yes. And we discovered only recently his line manager told him to come and say no to everything. And we can unpack some of those reasons. It's that top down, the managers and knowing best, and these upstarts coming forward and saying, hey, there's a problem, we want to solve it from the bottom up. That seemed to be an issue. So that's how we started.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, Pip, I can see you nodding in agreement with a lot of that. And I wonder whether you could pick up that theme and how you would respond to Paul in the light of your experience, both within and outside local authority.
Yeah, I was smiling, Paul, because some of the stuff you were describing is exactly the stuff that we come across day in, day out. People have a great idea, and then people on the public sector side have a very different sort of lens, if you like. I think that was a word I just jotted down here. They've got a very specific lens when looking at communities, when looking at space, people, all sorts of things, and it can be quite prescriptive, can't it? It's kind of a word we use a lot is traditional, I suppose, to try and sort of distinguish between that sort of that fixed view and the art of the possible. And I suppose an organisation, the reason I was smiling is because this is one of the things that we do in day in, day out, is we help people like you and organisations like WEG to make that idea a reality in communities up and down the country, and specifically around sort of creating health and social care enterprises. But very often there is an element of environmentalism in there. We've helped some organisations to plant trees, to plant gardens, to support all sorts of activities that get people outside, but also there's a sort of a environmental or a food related concern there. And it's really interesting. There's lots of reasons why people at the centre or in the public service can sort of look at it and sort of say, yes, but that's nothing to do with us, and they can put lots of barriers in the way. And I guess, an organisation like ours just comes along and helps to bridge that that divide. We kind of we're pretty good at managing that sort of between the community and between public services. We understand the language, if you like, of both, and the nuance of both, and can help people to navigate through that. But yeah,
we could have done with you back in the, at that time. We didn't. We just thought, of course they'll say yes and be enthusiastic.
I know, yeah.
Things and not the case at all.
No, it's surprising, isn't it? But once you then get an idea, and we use analogies like seeds and growing, ecosystems and stuff like that. Once a seed takes germinates, then the language and the culture and the behaviour of the public sector can really flourish along with it.
Actually,
But
that we're at a stage now, 3 or 4 years later, where we literally say to the city council, this is what we'd like to do next, and they say, go ahead.
Absolutely, yeah, because they've built that relationship with you, haven't they? And they've got that trust. They know that you're not just talking about something, you've made something happen, and they can see the benefits. And I think that's a lot of the work that we do, is about sort of walking alongside people in the community who have a great idea, and help them to realise that, but we keep demonstrating, helping them to demonstrate the benefits into the local authority, just simply because that's a way of keeping the idea moving in the right direction, and building that relationship, bridging that gap, as I said before. But it's thrilling when it gets going, but it can take a while, can't it? And unfortunately, a lot of people that aren't supported in that journey lose faith, and there's a lot of good ideas that don't get traction at the beginning.
Sure. I do think I might be being cynical here, but it's just a personal observation that when people are in management positions, I mean, even the word local authority is quite a loaded term.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And there's this kind of, we are in charge and we're in these positions because we know best. Now
it's our land, our money,
yes,
our people. I know. And I think there's a lot about language. We talk about language an awful lot. In fact, I have a really brilliant colleague called Bryony Shannon, who does a marvellous sort of podcast and blogs on language in social care, and the fact that can be a real barrier to people, because it is so loaded, isn't it? There's a lot of power in the language that's used by local authorities, and a lot of what we do is to sort of change things from that loaded language into a citizen-friendly language, so that there's a level playing field, so people understand each other, that we're talking the same language, but 2, to move that power dynamic from the centre to actually the people, because let's face it, local authorities, public sector in general, all funded by the public, aren't they? So it's all of us that they should be working with.
My area of expertise is tech, so we do automated conversations and stuff. But we did actually do some work with Callington Town Council because they wanted to have a route to hear the voice of the people that are on the street and what they wanted in their town. So we did a load of QR codes and stuff like that to be put on a lamppost and go speak to the lamppost. And it was connected to a chatbot, and it would take a load of feedback.
I love that one.
That kind of thing. So that works really well. But it does give them the permission of people to have those ideas, and those ideas to get through to somebody who's actually going to make some decisions against it and see what the traction is on a certain thing, or take votes on something. You can formulate however you like. Part of this was structured and part of it wasn't. So there was a little bit of, we need to get some idea about whether this is a good idea, and then also, have you got another one, sort of thing. And that worked quite well. It was on bins and lampposts and benches and stuff like that. And then they could just talk to the bench,
I really like that. I mean, in Worcester City Council, at the beginning of each council meeting, either committees or the full council meeting, there's about a 5-minute slot that members of the public can address the committee. And quite often when I'm there, there's nobody else, no other member of the public there. I think I love that idea, Steve, of actually putting it in on the street, where it's quite intimidating going to the Guildhall with all its chandeliers and paintings of mayors from the 18th century and so forth. But this, I really like that.
Well, the difference also was that the demographic of responders was completely different, because you'll get a lot younger demographic responding to what they thought should be there. And if we're thinking in town planning terms, you're planning for something that's going to be relevant in maybe 15 and 20 years. Well,
Absolutely.
the ones that are usually responding are over 65. Well, God bless them, they're not going to be around when that becomes fruition. So you're asking the wrong people of what you think should be there. You know, it should be people in their 30s and 20s and 30s even, you know, that are going to live in this place, or you want to retain those people in that place. So if you make it a place that they want to be, then maybe you'll retain and you won't have your brain drain, you know, and stuff like that. So there's lots of ramifications to it.
Can I be cynical again? Do we sometimes? I sometimes have a feeling there's lip service paid to. We're going to do a consultation. We're going to listen to you. It becomes a tick box exercise with people feeling actually there's very little change. Pip's nodding vigorously again.
I am, Paul, because I think, you know, this is something that we constantly battle against. I think that, you know, traditionally, let's use that word, that there's been a thing called consultation or engagement, public engagement, and it's very much as you say, they come, usually there's something that's been very much worked up into, this is what we're going to do, and now we're going to ask the public what they think, but we're not necessarily listening. And I think the public has become, you know, attuned to that we're being sort of shown something in a sort of a, have a look at this, but actually, you know, it's going to happen irrespective. We might make some tweaks, but essentially it's happened. But there has been a change in recent years. We're hearing a lot more around co-production, and actually, again, sometimes that's a you know, lip service. Co-production is used as a sort of, you know, we're going to co-produce this with our citizens, but actually it's just a front to more engagement or consultation. But we're working with a number of authorities at the moment on really great exercises that are truly co-produced, and they're using techniques like the ones that you know, were just described by Steve, you know, that sort of lampposts, people with, you know, helping people to have their voices heard, and that has to be a range of people. It has to be people that currently use whatever it is that we're talking about, and want to co-design going into the future, or people that might be using it, you know. So if we're looking at older people's or disabled people's services, we would want to get the views of younger people, as well as people who aren't currently drawing on anything, as well as people who are drawing on stuff and who are impacted, because you need that breadth, don't you? Because these are services that may or could influence, you know, me, my family, my friends, and my mum or whatever. So, you know, I think co-production is really, really important, and that moves away from it being lip service. That means, you know, hearing people's voices in a really authentic way, and then people working alongside. So, you know, I'm doing a really interesting piece of work with an authority in the London area at the moment, which is around helping them to understand what co-production is, set up a co-production group, and that will work alongside a transformation programme for carers, and will co-design what the future of carers services look like. And I'm really positive about it, because they're coming with, you know, they're bearing their souls in coming to that conversation, you know, and part of the reason for engaging us is to hold themselves to account, if you like, that there's a third party that's there to sort of guide through that process and make sure that there is a, if you like, it's done right.
Paul, just while we're kind of reflecting here on some of your experiences, I know some of the conversations we've had about your interest in 19th century self-help movements and of the trade unions, the friendly societies, the cooperatives, and I was wondering kind of what you take from your reading of that and how you would apply that to modern day services, whether it's environment or whether it's social care. Just wonder what sort of reflections that you might have to share.
Yeah, we've had quite a few conversations, mostly by email, going backwards and forwards about this. So I'm kind of feeling my way forward with this, to be perfectly honest. I think there's at that particular time, there were literally none of the agencies, the government agencies, or very few of the government agencies that now exist. So
we didn't have local authorities in the same way, did we?
That's right, and government was massively smaller than it is now, so forth. So the only option to those groups that you've just mentioned was to self-organize. They couldn't rely on a government agency because they literally didn't exist, and so forth. So I think, and I can't, and it'd be interesting to get insights from other people here. There's a plus and a minus for having these government agencies. One is that there are resources that are available that weren't available back in the 19th century. But on the flip side, I wonder sometimes if it creates dependency, where people rely on the government to sort their problems out, rather than trying to do what they can with themselves and their community to find solutions to the problems that they face.
I mean, interestingly, sorry, Steve.
No, it's all right. Well, it's just that I was over the years, I've seen the decline in the first line kind of services, not from government, but from different charities and CICs and stuff like that, where they're now, those were kind of the replacement to those. So they were a specialist service for, I don't know, drug rehabilitation and things like that, that you could go to, you could direct somebody to if they were trying to sort themselves out, and, you know, they would have a plan and they'd be able to do those things. But so much of that's disappeared because of lack of funding from the government as such, that they're, you know, most of the fund was delivered in that way. To, you know, so they obviously do some local fundraising, but the funds came from government, and those kind of organizations were those like, we will self-organize our specialist bit, but we need some money to do it because they can't survive without any cash at all. So I think they may be like the replacer, or were, but they're disappearing like there's no tomorrow, you know, or they have disappeared over the years. You know, my wife does a lot of work in child law, and she helps parents to try and get themselves on track, and those parents need to be directed. And she's now going, I have nowhere to send them because there is nowhere that can help that person rehabilitate, or to help with anger management, or, you know, whatever it may be, whatever their mental health issues are. There isn't anybody, so they don't get the help. So then that social has to take the kids into care, and the kids then have a really expensive on the system, if you like, and it just doesn't help. But that then means there aren't those end services, and that's the thing that we're missing, really. You know, so what's that?
2 points from me at this point of the conversation, folks, is I think one is with less money, it doesn't, as you say, Steve, we still need the funding of the community groups. And my view and my wider argument is actually, even if there's less funding, you can look at how it's spent. And often spending on big organizations doesn't give you as good value when you really pick it as spending on small organizations. And I know Pip herself will, you know, from your experience in Somerset, Pip, actually what you produced by self-directed support was cheaper because you had to make savings. I think the other point I want to make before I forget it is that you're talking about, I think, Paul, you mentioned people's individual strengths and their own capacity. And it's something that cropped up in the podcast this morning, didn't it, Steve? With my colleague John, who always in his work as a graphic artist with groups, it starts from the premise of, with these individuals, what's your super strength? You know, in other words, trying to move them away from dependency to, if you like, self-belief, if I can put it that way. So I think you've really hit on two really critical issues in this whole conversation about the empty waiting room for me. So really good.
Can I just say one more thing, Pip? Sorry.
Yeah. No, Paul, don't apologise.
My daughter and son-in-law are both OTs, occupational therapists, and in South Wales. And they've noticed that they made a comment a while back that when they deal with people who've been on the literally on the coal face or in the on the factory floor, they tend to have an attitude of tell me what to do. That's all they've experienced all their lives. Tell me what to do. Whereas if they go to people who've got a more professional background, people who've had more control over their lives, it's I've been looking on the internet and I'm wondering whether this might be the solution. What do you think? So I think that's kind of an interesting conversation with my family about that.
Pip, did you again? I see you nodding vigorously.
Yeah, no,
I think it's a good point to respond on.
Absolutely. I think this is the crux of it, isn't it? We've got currently a system, our public sector is very much, because of the constraints of funding, if you like, over the last few years, and the growth of the public sector, it's become a machine, or I often refer to it as a sausage factory, and it can only really cope with things that work in a certain way. So you have to get assessments for this, referrals for that, and so demand is all funneled through this really narrow funnel, and what it's created is a system that kind of has thresholds for this and thresholds for that, and criteria, if you like, it's probably a better word to use. And so what we end up with is long waiting times for an assessment, for a referral, for this, for a service, or for whatever. And so we push the service, because of this funneling, into more and more of a reactive system, into, if you like, a crisis-led system. And people, because they know they've got to go through this funnel, of course you react in a certain way, don't you? If you want something, you have to up the ante in order to get a response or whatever. So we've conditioned people to react in a certain way when they work with public services, and public services have reacted in a way that's quite defensive, because they're trying to manage demand. And it's not that anybody that goes into public service wants to do that. That's just the nature of trying to cope in a very pressured environment where it's very overwhelming. And that's really why I got really interested in working in sort of looking at how we could change that when I was in Somerset. And the stuff that you were talking about there, Nick, about this strength-based approach is changing the conversation, starting so that we're no longer responding to a crisis, we're no longer jumping in to, if you like, rescue people, but instead asking much broader questions. So what is it that you want to get out of your life? What matters to you, and what are you doing in order to get to achieve some of those goals? And then we start to look at what else is available within the community, what there might be able to help, and could we boost some of that stuff in the community in order to provide more early support intervention for people, so that people are able to find stuff, understand what's available, and self-help, if you like, before we come round, because there's always going to be a need for people who are in true difficulty and what have you, and we need to make sure that there are resources available for that. So it's about how we manage resources in a strength-based way, the conversations we have in the public sector, in the community, and as citizens ourselves, learning that actually we have to be resourceful as well. There are choices to be made, there are things that we can do to help ourselves. We need to draw on our own strengths and not just look to others. So, but how do we do that, and how do we enable people? Because a lot of the people that come to I don't know anyone that knocks on the door of the council or even the doctors that's kind of not in some way calling, in a desperate situation. It's usually the last thing you want to do is knock on the council, for help. And so actually we need to help people to have a good conversation at that point, to find out what, how we can solve that immediate issue, and then enable people to pick up the threads of their life. And I suppose that's where the work that we do comes in. It's that sort of enabling people to have the time and the space to have those conversations, because they're very often long conversations, particularly with people who've struggled, you know, in their lives for all sorts of reasons, whether that's health, you know, or mental health, physical well-being, you know, an illness or whatever. There's always a reason why people are struggling. So understanding that, and then we talk about walking alongside people, to hear, to listen, and support people to find out what's available within themselves, within the community, as well as within the public sector, so that we are enabling a sort of, I don't really like the word independence, because that suggests that I'm on my own. That's not what I mean. It's more about that sort of, well, I think strength, you know, pulling out my strength, enabling me to see the good stuff, enabling me to see that I can do this, that and the other with a little bit of guidance or support, or knowing that someone's there with me, someone's got my back. Yeah, bit of that.
Do you find that's difficult to get even the guidance though? Because that's, you've got to start with somebody's got to, and also we've got to bring that whole community into.
Yeah, so this is
where
where
it's going to do. So, but it's communicating that guidance is tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot, yeah. So some of the work that we do is working with practitioners so that they change their language, but it's also about changing the systems and the processes within the public sector, so that the way that information is provided and the guidance that's given enables people to know what's available, so that it's not always hidden, you know, at the end of an assessment. That actually, you know, we've now got a lot more sort of community hubs, community cafes, trained, you know, there's a brilliant project out of Frome, the Health Connections Mendip, where, you know, they've train people up in the community to be able to have good conversations, to enable people to understand, you know, that there's this, that and the other in the community that they can tap into without having to go to a professional in the first place. So and then others, actually, yeah, you do need to go and have a talk with someone. That's really important, so they know the red flags, in other words, you know, to help with that. So yeah, training people is really important, opening up the front door to all of our public services, so actually people get information earlier, making that accessible. You know, we in Somerset opened up this beachfront hotel, became a place where people could drop in for a bit of advice on anything from housing, benefits, social care, health, mental health, you know, help with your IT, opening letters, just understanding all your bank statements, anything. You know, it's that kind of thing, isn't it? Because sometimes it's the last straw. And then sort of, you know, having teams of, if you like, professionals within a community that know each other, that kind of work together, so that you know, you're starting to knit together all the different resources within a community to enable the community to become more resilient, to be more self-sustaining, etc. So that's the idea. And Paul, to go back, I think the original question was around cooperative societies are brilliant. I love them. There's some really good examples of self-organising communities. Again, I can cite loads in Somerset because it's my county, and I'm but then we're also really good at it down here in the southwest as well. But there's also a lot up in the north where the cooperative movement is really strong. But just, you know, down the road from me, a few miles away, there's a community that had a lot of older people. They were like, no agency will come here and provide care. It's too difficult, apparently, too expensive, apparently. They won't do a contract with the local authority, apparently. So they were like, right, we'll do it ourselves. So they set themselves up. They worked alongside one of the projects that Community Catalyst was involved in, so micro enterprises, and got some grants, you know, to get stuff up and going. And they've now got their own care stuff. I think I'll call it stuff because it's a range of all sorts of things: volunteers, micro providers, and then organisers. It's a whole range of stuff, like I say, that's just there, so that the local community now has, you know, a range of different people providing all sorts of different care and support, or just, you know, a friendly conversation, or help with a prescription, or getting to the shops, or to getting to the GP surgery. But yeah, very much doing it for themselves, but not completely in isolation. You know, they are supported by the local authority. There's a connection, and I think that's what we hear, you know, and enable in our work is a lot of connecting the dots, because, you know, I've lived in lots of different places in this country and in Europe, and you know, there's always stuff going on, isn't there, under the surface? You know, when you first move to somewhere, well, like when I moved to this village, you know, okay, so I need, you know, someone that will help with the kids from time to time, or with the animals from time to time, and you kind of ask a neighbour, don't you, or you ask somebody that, you know, is in the local shop, and this underground network exists. What we've kind of got good at Community Catalysts is connecting that natural ecosystem that operates with what's going on in the public sector, because you need a bit of both. There are times when the public sector absolutely needs to come in and do the stuff it's good at. You know, there are lots of people that don't get the benefits that they need in order to live in in a decent way, because only when you've got all of that, Maslow's, you know, theory is correct. You need the basics in place before you can then start to do other things, and enable yourself to have a good life.
Oh, I can come back on this, because I can see you.
I grew up in a working class environment. I had free school dinners and free school uniforms. My father, in contrast, a previous generation, was bright enough to go to a grammar school, but parents couldn't afford the uniform. So at the age of 13, he was a butcher's boy delivering. And it was just picking up on something you said about often it's just those small, relatively small, low cost interventions that made a massive difference.
Absolutely. And I can't tell you, Paul, how many, you know, that's exactly it. It is that sort of, that little bit of help, you know, the odd little bit, you know. That's, so one of the things I did in Somerset was set up the or enable the village agents to grow as a network. So these are people that work in their own local community, and again, they would work alongside a family. They would identify someone, you know, like that, and 20, 30 quid that might help that kid to get to school without, you know, in a uniform or whatever. And that's the kind of, you know, thing that we would enable, because it gets someone, you know, a little bit further forward, doesn't it? And food, again, we during the pandemic, food was not only an essential, it was also a way of opening up conversations and really getting to know people, to build a relationship, to understand some broader things that weren't working, and then make sure that the right support was coming in to enable people to just get above, you know, get their head up and survive, and then you can get into a place where people are able to thrive. All too often public services are just there to help people to survive, and then, you know, you're kind of dropped. You know, we see lots of people going in and out of services because you meet the criteria, you get your 6 weeks support, and then you're dropped. Well, then if you've not fixed the underlying issues, they'll come back again. And so a lot of the work in a strength-based sort of way of working is about that longer term, putting in the scaffolding, putting in the things that actually enable people to you know, to thrive in the long term. But and it's not much. Sometimes it's really small things, giving people confidence, a listening ear, a little bit of money sometimes, you know, for a bit of equipment in the kitchen, or a bit of something that you know, sometimes it's just short of a you know, some money for the electricity one week, and that can be it. That spins people completely. Yeah.
This has been a kind of brilliant conversation about how to change the paradigm for me, away from this kind of top-down dependency, this top-down hierarchy, into building from the ground upwards, and actually, if you do it this way, it empties the waiting room, rather than the top-down way, which actually fills it up, because actually you're almost creating so much need that you can't deal with it. So the waiting room is full because you've got the wrong way of approaching this. So, and it you know, points towards a concept I talk about in the book called inclusive leadership. And what I mean by that is we're all leaders. you know, the leadership doesn't just come from the top. All of us have got something to contribute, and I was certainly taken, Paul, by the time you describing your experience at the beginning about how you shifted from kind of, well, what do you want us to do, to telling the local authority this is what we're going to do for you, because that confidence that grew and it took you into a different space. So I want to say thank you very much for what I found an extremely engaging conversation, just listening to the two of you, given your different backgrounds. I thought it was extremely, extremely positive, and exactly what I was hoping would come out of this, if I'm honest. So thank you. And you did it without payment. So
Now you
and,
tell us.
but anyway, thank you ever so much for that. I really, really do appreciate it. So thank you, and all the best to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Well, in this episode, we covered we had to define, first of all, what self-organisation meant.
Yeah.
So that's something about from doing to people to actually investing in communities and people themselves, from being prescriptive to the art of possible, helping people to help themselves. And in this conversation, we looked at even the word local authority is itself a loaded term. It's a very hierarchical term often, and concluded that language says everything in this conversation. So also acknowledging that in previous eras, before public services, communities themselves had to self-organise. And what's happened historically is that although we now have this whole why we spend an awful lot of money on public services, we've actually in part created dependency for people on these services and got away from encouraging people to help themselves. We had an interesting conversation about talking to lampposts, litter bins and park benches, and linked to QR codes and bots as a way of hearing voices in local places and maximising the demographic reach of surveys and assessments to work out what people wanted. We talked about how funding should in future be directed to self-organisation, giving cash to frontline organisations or people themselves to actually deliver the services that they want, and to trust them that they will provide the services they want and need. And I think we went on to talk about how commissioners have got themselves boxed in by what I know Pip called a sausage factory mentality, where demand now is funneled in a very particular way through assessment, referral, creating criteria for service and thresholds, which paradoxically leads to longer waiting times for public services, recipients becoming reactive and defensive, and commissioners themselves becoming defensive. So this whole system, in fact, fills the waiting room. It doesn't empty it. So we went on finally to talk about, acknowledging that no one knocks on the door of public services without a reason. So we need to shift solutions to prevention, leaving professionals to sort out the real complexity that communities can't organise for themselves, and train people to have good conversations and connect to the natural ecosystems that exist in communities. So it's kind of creating a long-term community scaffolding, which in essence reduces the need for public services and allows them to concentrate on what they're good at, and therefore reduces cost.
Let's go over again what our takeaways are for this episode.